So, okay, okay. So, thank you very much, Seth, for coming in. We are DIY Beatmungsgerät, a very nice German-English mixture of words. Essentially, we started like about 3 weeks ago at the German government's hackathon, where we tried to hack the COVID-19 crisis, and a lot of projects started there. And since then, we got about 50 active people on our Discord server and about 300 who seem to be passively listening in, discussing what to do. And we are following about 4 technical leads right now. One is the automated ambu bag design, which I think quite a lot of people follow. The second was to build a piston-based pump. The third was actually inspired by the PB560 project, and the fourth is just use an external compressor and some valves to do this stuff. So far we have, I think, 2 prototypes or several prototypes. We have 2, I guess, with a ambu bag based design, and we have another one just under construction on the piston based design. And we are quite actively monitoring or trying to monitor all the 80, 100 other projects currently around. And we looked at the beginning into the PB560 when it was made public, but concluded that there were some technical difficulties and they wouldn't follow that lead actively. But since you have made a lot of progress, I invited you to join, and I'm recording this session so we can put people onto the link later who have no time right now. And so maybe you just start, and or you could say something about your project, and then you just start.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sebastian. I am Seth Hillbrand. I'm here representing the Open Ventilator project, one of the many projects named Open Ventilator, but we didn't have time for a better name. So I will give the background of our project and what we hope to achieve and where we are at the moment. And then I'll follow with the current limitations that we are encountering and how we hope to overcome them. So if you can see my first slide here, this is the overview. There are approximately 120 people involved with the project, with 20 active engineers, designers, and another 10 or so firmware programmers. And we have a small group of lawyers, as well as some electronics manufacturers, designers, and others who are working on this project in various aspects. So our goals with this, for those of you who don't know, the Medtronic PB560 was released earlier this year under a moderately restrictive license that constrains how long it is allowed to be produced, modified, redistributed to no later than 2024, or when the WHO declares this pandemic to be ended. So we took this with a bit of concern because, as you may have noticed, there are a lot of pieces involved in the PB560, and the design is approximately 12 to 13 years old, which means that most of the original components are end-of-life components. They exist only in manufacturer stock, where the manufacturer has a stockpile of the elements, and they have existing agreements with the original manufacturers to provide stock of parts for their ventilators. So we took that and said that we needed to update this. I'm sorry if there's, Sebastian, could I ask you to mute real quick? Thank you. So we said that we needed to short circuit this for any manufacturers who are interested in providing, interested in building this, we needed to make the path shorter for them in order to get this into production in as short a time as possible in order to make an impact. So the first thing that we did was we said we needed to order or modernize the bill of materials. We needed to take the original list of components and identify those that have been end-of-lifed by their manufacturer and replace them with those components that are currently in production and available in volume around the world. Then once we did that, many of those components were going to need to be replaced with work alike, not exactly the same components. And so the firmware itself would need to be updated in order to support those similar components. So examples of this would be memory elements, the flash memory, which is much larger than it was in 15 years ago. And so we have an issue where it's hard to find smaller memory chips in the parallel access configuration that the design wants. And so our solution was to take the larger memory chips that are available today and simply ignore the top section, the top half of the memory size, and then just adjust the code in the firmware. Other examples of firmware updates will be for the turbine. We cannot source the original turbine for this manufacturing process, and so replacing the turbine will require changing the PID components of the control feedback loop. That is a firmware change that we will place in the firmware to make this a complete manufacturable system. Our third goal is to simplify the system to make it easier to produce in more locations around the world. The original bill of materials included a number of custom screws, for instance, that are manufactured that are capture screws. These are specialty components that are manufactured only by one company in Pennsylvania. We are replacing these with standard Phillips head screws that can be sourced anywhere in the world. And we are also looking to allow the manufacture of this ventilator in locations around the world. We understand that there are many different open source ventilator projects out there. Most of them are some form of the bag valve mechanism where there is a squeezing action on a bag that goes in, or that feeds into a mask that provides positive pressure on the airway. This is mostly utilized as emergency stopgap ventilators, and what we're looking to provide is a ventilator that has a number of additional useful features for the COVID crisis, specifically pressure and volume based breath feedback control. This is built into the firmware, it's built into the training manuals in the PV560, and if we can solve the issues around sourcing, then the manufacture of this becomes possible in places that have very low ventilator densities. So in Western Europe, in the United States, we have very high ventilator densities and are able to support a very large number of simultaneous uses. But many countries are not so fortunate, and part of the reason is not the raw material cost of a ventilator, but rather the intellectual property and the manufacturing difficulties associated with that. So if we are successful in this process, then we open up the manufacture of these ventilators in regions that would otherwise not have access to them. So I'm going to see if I can move on to the next slide. So where are we right now? Right now, here we go. Right now, we have 90% of our PCBs, printed circuit boards, have been updated. Some examples of the renders here on the right. The electronics bill of materials has been revised to use commonly available commonly available items in global supply chains, and the distribution channels have been established where we are talking with ventilator distributors who interface between the manufacturers and the hospitals that need to purchase or acquire ventilators. Our ongoing work at the moment includes the mechanical bill of materials revision. We're working on continuing to simplify and update the mechanical items in the construction of this ventilator. The primary microchip is still an open question for us. This utilizes an ST10 microchip architecture. There is only one ST10 microchip that is still in active production, and it is in limited stock around the world. We've attempted to source this in volume, but we are finding that back orders extend well into late 2020 and early 2021. We hypothesize that this is largely due to the PB560 manufacturer, as this there are a number of established companies such as Foxconn and the Vietnamese manufacturing company that are looking to produce tens of thousands of ventilators per week, which, if true, if they are successful with this sort of scale that they are advertising, they will be sourcing far more of the ST10s than are currently available on the open market, and this would be pushing the supply chains back. This also means that smaller markets would not be able to compete with the purchasing power that you see from these larger manufacturers. And so we are examining a dual path right now on the primary microprocessor, where we have one single the original microprocessor unit and board and firmware that exists as an option, and then a second board and firmware that provides the same functionality, but which has been replaced by a more widely available STM32 chip, or similar. There is a small contingent of microchip users who are interested in porting to a microchip-based platform. This has not been decided yet. We are evaluating what the cost, both to our time as well as to the ability to be certified for use would be. One of our major concerns is that the production of the ventilator does, in normal times, need to proceed through a certification process by the regulatory agency that controls medical equipment. In the United States and in many countries in Europe, this is currently being superseded by emergency regulation, but the emergency regulation only is valid for certain modifications. And once we go outside of these modification regimes, then we are no longer able to be used in these countries. We want to avoid that to the extent possible, and so we have the lawyers with our group currently looking at the regulations that have been published to see how far in the modification we would be allowed to go without rendering our work unusable based on the level of modification that would be needed. So that is the third point there. The Food and Drug Administration is the United States regulatory body. Their emergency use authorization paperwork is the start paperwork that we need to fill in order for this ventilator to be usable within the United States. It appears that the European bodies are regulated on a country-by-country basis rather than a European Union-wide basis, and so we have one group working with the Spanish authorities at the moment to define the limitations of modification for the emergency use authorization in Spain. We're actively looking for lawyers who have experience with the various regulatory bodies around the world, and if there are people who have contacts with them, I would greatly appreciate them reaching out to me, and I will start putting them in contact with the information that they need in order to help us get the ventilator approved within their market. So, what do we have left? Our remaining challenges. This is always the big open issue. We've talked with a number of manufacturers in countries around the world that are looking to manufacture this PB560, and they all get stuck in the exact same place. And this is the turbine. That's the picture on the right. That is the air fan turbine that was originally sourced for the PB560. Airfan is a small French company that manufactures these turbines for ventilators. They are back ordered for as far as they can see. Our understanding is that they have a manufacturing contract with Renault to update the manufacturer to increase their production, but from our conversations with them, they are not shipping updated units of their turbine to anyone who was not a pre-existing customer of theirs before this happened. In other words, they are prioritizing the people with whom they already have relationships. This makes sense, of course, but it does place a strong limitation on the usability of the PB560 if we are unable to source a replacement. Now, we have 3 areas that we're looking to approach replacing this with. One area is going with an alternate manufacturer. We are talking right now with a company called Respironics Philips in California in order to source an alternate turbine through them. But this is many countries are imposing export controls on ventilator type products, including the United States and as well as Europe itself. So exporting components that are used for ventilators is unlikely to be available until the demand for ventilators goes down, which means that any manufacturer of a large component like this that we source in one country does not provide us with the ability to manufacture these around the world. In order to address this, we have a team of mechanical engineers who are reverse engineering the system in order to build out a turbine housing and blade that could be fit to any of the commonly available brushless DC motors that power the turbine. There are a number of caveats to this. Turbines need to have a continuous operation that is uncommon in most brushless DC motors, and so they do need to be rated for a long-term continuous operation. However, if we are able to address that, then the remaining challenge is to fabricate a mold, so the housing and plastic airways that compress the gas into the ventilator itself. These need to be rated for oxygen, which is a more stringent requirement on the injection mold than is typically than typically exists. Additionally, because these operate at such high speeds, the revolutions per minute are so large that small imbalances in the manufacturing process can cause devastating results, as they can cause vibrations and cracking in the fan blades, which would be problematic, obviously, to the proper functioning of the ventilator. So as we proceed here, we're looking at two pathways, both identifying existing manufacturers whose components could be used to replace the air fan turbine, as well as modeling the actual pathways we would need to give to a manufacturer that would allow them to create a turbine of their own design using standard injection mold techniques. Additionally, the LCD and housing replacement, which is the image on the bottom. The LCD is an older model LCD that is no longer manufacturable and has a number of unique components. So we have a team working right now that is taking the LCD protocol and replacing that with a FPGA that sits in between the MCU that speaks the older protocol and the LCD screen that works on a newer protocol. This allows us to remove the single source LCD controller that is not currently available, and still work with the standard firmware that outputs data to the LCD screen. We also are able to swap the display technologies after the fact to meet local market availabilities. So that work continues to be ongoing. And the final challenge we have is the battery housing. The battery itself is fairly standard. We're able to source welded battery stacks without too much difficulty, but we do still need to model and replace the extruded aluminum housing that protects the battery. This, in the release, in the PB560 release, they did not release the source code for the firmware that controls the battery charger, which means that the external battery charger would not be usable without the battery control module providing the correct identification sequence, which we don't know at the moment. And so, in order to reverse engineer that, we will need to replace the entire battery control module and programming for the charge pack on the external battery charger. So those three items are our remaining challenges and where we're working through them. With that, if you have any questions, I am happy to answer them, and I appreciate your having me on today.
Thank you very much. I just had to unmute myself. I think we'll stop the recording here. I will write down all the questions and the answers, or maybe we just start a second recording and